The House with a Clock in Its Walls by John Bellairs. Chapter 1. Louis Barnevelt fidgeted and wiped his sweaty palms on the seat of the bus that was roaring toward New Zebedee. The year was 1948. It was a warm, windy summer evening. Outside, that is. Louis could see the moonlit trees tossing gently beyond his window, which was sealed shut like all the windows on the bus. He looked down at his purple corduroy trousers, the kind that go whip when you walk. He put his hand up and rubbed it across his hair, which was parted in the middle and slicked down with wild root cream oil. His hand was greasy now, so he wiped it on the seat again. His lips were moving, and he was saying a prayer. It was one of his altar boy prayers. For thou, O God, art my strength. Why have you cast me off, and why do I go sorrowful while the enemy afflicts me? He tried to remember more prayers, but the only one he could come up with was another question. Why art thou sorrowful, O my soul, and why do you trouble me? It seemed to Louis that all he could think of these days were questions. Where am I going? Who will I meet? Will I like them? What will happen to me? Louis Barnevelt was 10 years old. Until recently, he had lived with his parents in a small town near Milwaukee, but his father and mother had been killed suddenly one night in an auto accident, and now Louis was on his way to New Zebedee, the county seat of Capernaum County in the state of Michigan. He was going to live with his Uncle Jonathan, whom he had never met in his life. Of course, Louis had heard a few things about Uncle Jonathan, like that he smoked and drank and played poker. These were not such bad things in a Catholic family, but Louis had two maiden aunts who were Baptists, and they had warned him about Jonathan. He hoped that the warnings would turn out to be unnecessary. As the bus rounded a curve, Louis looked at his reflection in the window next to his seat. He saw a moony, fat face with shiny cheeks. The lips on the face were moving. Louis was saying the altar boy prayers again, this time with the wish that they might make Uncle Jonathan like him. Judge me, O God. No, don't judge me. Help me live a happy life. It was 5 minutes to 9 when the bus pulled up in front of Hemoth's Rexall drugstore in the town of New Zebedee. Louis got up, wiped his hands on his trousers, and tugged at the enormous cardboard suitcase that hung over the edge of the metal rack. Louis's father had bought the suitcase in London at the end of World War II. It was covered with ripped and faded Cunard line stickers. Louis pulled hard, and the suitcase lurched down onto his head. He staggered back across the aisle with the suitcase held perilously in the air. Then he sat down suddenly, and the suitcase landed on his lap with a whump. Oh, come on, don't kill yourself before I have a chance to meet you. There in the aisle stood a man with a bushy red beard that was streaked in several places with white. His Big Mac khaki trousers were bulged out in front by his pot belly, and he was wearing a gold-button red vest over a blue work shirt. Louis noticed that the vest had 4 pockets. There were pipe cleaners sticking out of the top 2, and a chain of paper clips was strung between the lower pair. At the end of the chain on one end of the chain was hooked to the winding knob of a gold watch. Jonathan Van Olden Barnevelt took his steaming pipe out of his mouth and held out his hand. Hi, Louis. I'm your Uncle Jonathan. I recognized you from a picture your father once sent me. Welcome to New Zebedee. Louis shook hands and noticed that the back of Jonathan's hands was covered with a springy mat of red hair. The coat of hair ran right up his sleeve and disappeared. Louis wondered if he had red hair all over his body. Jonathan hefted the suitcase and started down the steps of the bus. Good Lord, what a monster. You ought to have wheels on the bottom. Did you pack some bricks from your house? Louis looked so sad at the mention of his house that Jonathan decided to change the subject. He cleared his throat and said, Well now, as I was saying, welcome to Capernaum County and the beautiful historic New Zebedee, population 6,000, not counting. A bell overhead began to strike the hour. Jonathan stopped talking. He froze on the spot. He dropped the suitcase, and then his arms hung limp at his sides. Louis, frightened, looked up at him. Jonathan's eyes were glazed. The bell continued to toll. Lewis looked up. The sound was coming from a tall brick steeple across the street. The arches of the belfry made a howling mouth and two gaping eyes. Below the mouth was a large glowing clock face with iron numerals. Clang! Another stroke. It was a deep-throated iron bell, and its sound made Lewis feel hopeless and helpless. Bells like that always did. But what was wrong with Uncle Jonathan? The tolling stopped. Jonathan broke out of his trance. He shook his head convulsively, and with a jerky motion raised his hand to his face. He was sweating profusely now. He mopped his forehead on his streaming cheeks. Oh, sorry, Lewis. I just remembered that I left a kettle boiling on the stove. I always phase out like that when I remember something I've forgotten, or vice versa. Bottom of the pot's probably ruined by now. Come on, let's get moving. Lewis looked hard at his uncle, but he said nothing. Together, the two of them started to walk. They left the brightly lit Main Street, and before long they were trotting briskly down a long, tree-lined avenue called Mansion Street. The overhanging boughs made Mansion Street into a long, rustling tunnel. Pools of lamplight stretched off into the distance. As they walked, Jonathan asked Lewis how his schoolwork was coming, and whether he knew what George Kell's batting average was this year. He told him that he would have to become a Tiger fan now that he lived in Michigan. Jonathan did not complain any more about his suitcase, but he did stop frequently to set it down and flex his reddened hand. It seemed to Lewis that Jonathan talked more loudly in the darkness between the streetlights, though why he did this Lewis couldn't say. Grown-ups were not supposed to be afraid of the dark, and anyway, this was not a dark, lonely street. There were lights on in most of the houses, and Lewis could hear people laughing and talking and slamming doors. His uncle was certainly a strange person, but he was strange in a likable way. At the corner of Mansion and High, Jonathan stopped. He set down the suitcase in front of a mailbox that said, "For deposit of mail only." "I live at the top of the hill," said Jonathan, pointing up. High Street was well named. Up they went, leaning forward and plodding slowly. Lewis asked Jonathan several times if he could carry the suitcase, but each time Jonathan said no, thanks, he could manage it. Lewis began to be sorry that he had packed all those books and lead soldiers. When they got to the top of the hill, Jonathan set down the suitcase. He took out a red bandana handkerchief and mopped his face with it. "Well, there it is, Lewis. Barneveldt's Folly. What do you think of it?" Lewis looked. He saw a 3-story stone mansion with a tall turret on the front. The whole house was lit up, downstairs, upstairs, and upper upstairs. There was even a light in the little oval window that was set like an eye in the bank of shingles at the top of the turret. In the front yard grew a large chestnut tree. Its leaves rustled in the warm summer breeze. Jonathan was standing at parade rest, his hands behind him, his legs wide apart. Again he said, "What do you think of it, Lewis, eh?" "I love it, Uncle Jonathan. I've always wanted to live in a mansion, and this is sure some mansion." Lewis walked up the frilly fence and touched one of the iron pom-poms that ran in a row along the top. He stared at the sign that spelled out 100 in red glass reflectors. "Is it real, Uncle Jonathan? The house, I mean?" Jonathan glanced at him strangely. Yes, of course it is. It's real. Let's go inside." Jonathan lifted the loop of shoestring that held the gate shut. The gate squeaked open and Lewis started up the walk. Jonathan followed close behind, lugging the suitcase. Up the front steps they went. The front hall was dark, but there was a light at the far end of it. Jonathan set down the suitcase and put his arm around Lewis. "Come on, let's go in. Don't be bashful. It's your house now." Lewis walked down the long hall. It seemed to take forever. At the other end, he emerged into a room full of yellow light. There were pictures in heavy gilt frames on the walls. There was a mantelpiece covered with a wild assortment of junk. There was a big round table in the middle of the room, and over in the corner was a gray-haired woman in a baggy purple dress. She was standing with her ear to the wall, listening. Lewis stopped and stared. He felt embarrassed. It was as if he had walked in on someone who was doing something he shouldn't be doing. He thought that he and Jonathan had made a good deal of noise coming in, but it was very apparent that the lady, whoever she was, had been surprised when he entered the room, surprised and embarrassed like himself. Now she straightened up, smoothed her dress, and said cheerfully, "Hi there! I'm Mrs. Zimmerman. I live next door." Louis found himself staring into one of the wrinkliest faces he had ever seen, but the eyes were friendly, and all the wrinkles were drawn up into smile lines. He shook hands. "This is Louis, Florence," said Jonathan. "You remember Charlie writing about him? The bus was on time for a change. They must have gotten the driver drunk. Hey, have you been stealing any of my coins?" Jonathan walked over to the table. Now Louis noticed that the red checkered tablecloth was covered with heaps and stacks of coins. All kinds of coins, most of them foreign. Donut-shaped Arabian coins with Boy Scout knots all over them. A heap of dark brown copper coins, all of which were stamped with pictures of a bald man who wore a handlebar mustache. There were big, heavy English pennies that showed Queen Victoria in various states of chinniness, and there were tiny silver coins, no thicker than your fingernail. There was an egg-shaped Mexican silver dollar and a genuine Roman coin, covered with green rust, but most of all, in shiny golden stacks, were brass coins with "Bon part un franc" printed on them. Louis liked the phrase, and since he didn't know any French, got it twisted around in his mind till it came out. "Bon sour 1 franc." "No, I have not been stealing any of your precious brasher doubloons," said Mrs. Zimmerman in an irritated voice. "I was just straightening up the stacks, okay, Brushmush?" "Straightening up the stacks? I've heard that one before, Hagface. But it doesn't matter, because we're going to have to divvy up the coins 3 ways. You play poker, don't you, Louis?" "Yes, but my dad won't—" He stopped. Jonathan saw tears in his eyes. Louis choked down a sob and went on. My dad wouldn't have let me play for money." "Oh, we don't play for money," said Mrs. Zimmerman, laughing. "If we did, this house and everything in it would belong to me." "Poop it would," said Jonathan, shuffling the cards and puffing clouds of smoke from his pipe. "Poop it would. Get 'em all divided up, Frumpy? No? Well, when you're ready, it's going to be dealer's choice. And I'm the first dealer. No ladies' games like Spit Out the Window or Johnny's Nightshirt. Straight 5-card draw, nothing wild." He puffed some more, and was about to deal the first hand, when he stopped and looked at Mrs. Zimmerman with a mischievous smile. "Oh, by the way," he said, "you might bring Louis a glass of iced tea and get me a refill. No sugar, and bring out another plate of chocolate chip cookies." Mrs. Zimmerman stood up and clasped her hands subserviently in front of her. "How would you like your cookies, sir? Stuffed down your throat one by one, or crumbled up and sifted into your shirt collar?" Jonathan stuck out his tongue at her. "Ignore her, Louis. She thinks she's smart because she's got more college degrees than I have." "I would be smarter than you in any case, Weirdbeard. Excuse me, folks, I'll be back in a minute." She turned and walked to the kitchen. Jonathan dealt a practice hand while she was gone. When Louis picked his cards up, he noticed that they were old and worn. Most of the corners were missing, and on each faded blue back was a round golden seal with an Aladdin's lamp in the middle. Above and below the seal were the words, "Capernaum County Magicians Society." Mrs. Zimmerman returned with the cookies and iced tea, and the game began in earnest. Jonathan gathered up the cards and cut them together with a very professional zzzt. He shuffled and started to deal. Louis sipped his iced tea and felt very comfortable, very at home. They played until midnight, by which time Louis had red and black spots in front of his eyes. Pipe smoke hung in layers over the table and rose in a column from the shade of the floor lamp. It made the lamp seem magic, like the one on the playing cards. And there was something else magic about the game. Louis won. He won a lot. Usually he had rotten luck, but in this game he got straight flushes, royal flushes, 4 of a kind. Not all of the time, but enough to keep winning steadily. And we will pause there.